Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the John Doe podcast. And today I want to give you a quick take on the article in this week's Sunday Times, dated the 29th of January 2024, in which we had the following headline: Exposed, Foreign Students Get Secret Route to Top Universities. This took up most of the front page of the Sunday Times, as you can see here, and there was also a double page spread in the paper going into more detail. And I just want to share a perspective on this as someone who knows a little bit about this industry, because I think it might be that the reality is different to how the newspaper is presenting it. Now, this is presenting the fact that universities in the UK, and especially the prestigious Russell Group universities, of which there are 24, are recruiting international students and doing so with agents who will go out and literally find foreign students who are willing to pay a lot of money to come and study at these prestigious British institutions. And what the article drew attention to is the fact that many of these students are being given pathways to entry that are, rather than direct entry, they can actually take a foundation course, so it can be an international foundation, which allows them to then gain entry to the university with the equivalent of lower academic grades than would be required of a domestic student, an Indigenous British student. And the take from the Sunday Times is a fairly sort of pro-British in the sense that their complaint is that this is an unfair system and that British students are, in a sense, being treated unfairly and are losing out to foreign students who basically have the money to be able to buy their way onto degree placements, where British students would be excluded from these. Now, I can see how this appears, but I think that the thing to consider is that, this may not actually be another case of diversity gone mad. Because if you look at the economics, you can see that the reason universities are doing this is quite pragmatic. Now, anyone who remembers their Thomas Sowell remembers that people basically follow incentives and constraints, and that the same applies to institutions, and even people within institutions will be making decisions based on, what rewards they can get and what limitations they exist within. And in this case, actually, this is pretty self-evident when you think about the tuition fees. So, as we all know, when Tony Blair came to power back in the late 90s, his slogan was education, education, education. And whilst previously in this country we used to have only perhaps the top 5% or so of the most gifted students intellectually would be going to university, this was then expanded out to aim for about 50%. So an increase of, sort of 5 to 10-fold of the number of students going to university each year. Many former polytechnics became universities, but this placed a huge demand on institutions. And the reason is that previously, when we only had the top sort of 5 or 10%, the government funded their education. People would get grants, and this is how that degree was funded, and this made sense. But once this was expanded to many times more students, it became impossible for the government to be able to fund all of these degrees as they previously had done. And this is, of course, why we brought in tuition fees, and they came in and then were kind of gradually increased to the point where now it has been capped at £9,250 per year per student. Now, the problem with that for universities is that some of the degrees that they deliver, particularly medical degrees or STEM subjects, cost a lot more than other subjects, things in the arts and the humanities, and they can actually be in a situation where they are prevented from charging enough money for student fees to even be able to cover the costs of degrees that they that involve perhaps a lot of technology and research. And so in order to subsidize these, they've expanded to bring in more students. There are some degrees that are lower cost to deliver, and this works well with the government targets for increasing the number of domestic students attending university. But there was a loophole. The government, whilst they limited the student fees in the UK for domestic students to £9,250 per year, they didn't put a cap on what could be charged to foreign students, or what are now called international students, and kind of a euphemistic term. It's the same thing. And so what this has meant for universities is that the way they've had left open to gain additional funding is to basically market their degrees overseas to foreign students who want to have the prestige of having come and studied at a British university, and particularly the top universities, the Russell Group, as they're known. They are willing to come, and they will charge 2, perhaps 3 times as much money for those students to study in the UK. So when we get back to looking at the entry requirements, now many of those students will still have to meet the entry requirements of universities that are equivalent to what a domestic student would have to. The article is only highlighting that there are some students who then will go on who will not meet these direct entry requirements. And so what will happen with those students is they will do an international year 1 or an international foundation. It's a 1-year course usually, and it will focus on improving their English language skills as well as their academic skills. And the idea is that it helps them to get to the level that a university can accept for entry. However, as the Sunday Times pointed out, sometimes they're still not coming in at the same level as students. Sometimes it's their English language level that is a problem and can hinder them. And sometimes it can be their academic skills. And they do have a legitimate complaint here in that the quality of students coming in, if they are significantly below in terms of their ability and preparedness to study at one of these degrees, well, yes, that could hamper the education of students who've come through the traditional route, British students, who are then suffering because the learning is being pitched at a lower level. Now, that is a legitimate problem, and I think universities should think very carefully about how this is going to potentially impact their reputation. But the point is, it's not fair to say that international or foreign students are coming in and taking the places of British domestic students, because what's really happening is those international students are there subsidizing the cost and the price of those courses. They are there paying 2 or 3 times as much money to be there, and that's what is allowing these universities to continue delivering these degrees, whilst British students are only charged £9,250 per year. So in effect, it's the fact that those international students are there in the first place that is allowing the universities to continue delivering this many degrees. So in actual fact, you could look at this the other way around and say, well, really, if the universities were prevented from doing so, well, where are they going to get the funding? And if they don't have the funding, they're going to have to cut back on degrees. And this means that domestic students are actually going to lose out because there will be fewer places available overall for students. Now, there are some universities who have been posting huge financial deficits. Coventry University, not long ago, posted a deficit of £100 million. The university sector in the UK is struggling, and when we're looking at why they are taking measures such as marketing degrees to foreign students, you've got to look at this and say, well, ultimately, what is happening here is that foreign students are bringing in more money. Universities are between a rock and a hard place. They can't charge domestic students more than £9,250 a year, but that isn't going to cover the cost of delivering some of their high-end courses. And so the only option that's left open to them is to attract foreign students who are going to pay 2 or 3 times as much money to come and study on these degrees. And so, they've gone in here and interviewed people from some of the international education providers, and the recruitment teams. This is the thing that I think perhaps is surprising to people who don't know this. Universities now, the international department is a very big part of all universities. They will have heads of recruitment, they will have heads of international, heads of or directors of Global or Pro-Vice Chancellor of Global or International. And basically this is all revolved around this whole part of the university that is about recruiting overseas students to come and study, essentially, in order to fund the university to continue to exist. So it's kind of understandable that when they are looking to recruit international students, and their concern is funding, that if they get to a situation where some students are not meeting the entry requirements, their incentive isn't that they're delivering these in the first place to simply provide education. It really is about the money. And so if they're finding a way to say, look, we can get a few more students in, we need the money. I'm not saying that this is the right thing to do. I'm saying this should be understood in terms of financial incentives and constraints. That's why this is happening. The main driver of this ultimately is money. If people wanted to change this, well, what would have to happen is that, if you're going to get rid of the international students, well, where's the funding going to come from? And what you would see at that point, if you wanted to cap international recruitment or limit it drastically, is that, well, universities are going to have a huge funding deficit. This means a lot of them are going to close. There are some universities that are already in danger of closing or having to kind of amalgamate. Some universities really are struggling at this point, and there will be far fewer. Now, if you were looking at this and saying, well, maybe the problem is that this whole move in the first place of trying to get half of all students to go to university was a mistake, well, maybe you'd be onto something, because then maybe if we reduced the target of having 50% of domestic students going to university, and we went back to the old model where only the top 5, maybe 10% of the intellectual elite, who are going to be groomed to be kind of the new elite of the country, go to university, well, maybe that would be something the government could still fund. And then maybe everyone else, rather than doing these bullshit degrees that don't get you a job and just end you up in huge amounts of student debt, maybe they could go and do something else, like an apprenticeship. And maybe they would be economically, financially better off if they were to do that. Obviously, that's a conversation for another day, and whether the government is going to do that seems very, very unlikely. But anyway, that's the reality. I hope that was interesting to kind of hear that perspective, and thanks for your time. I will see you in the next episode. Bye for now.